I think it's fair to say that when this panel convened in February, nobody believed that Donald Trump would be the Republican presidential nominee. And I think it's probably also fair to say that now, a little less than 5 weeks before the election, a lot of people still can't believe that Donald Trump is the Republican presidential nominee. But, of course, he is. So what our panelists are going to try to do tonight is offer their perspective on where the election stands right now and potentially where we're heading as we move towards Election Day. It's typically the case that presidential politics is contentious, and it's not uncommon for presidential politics to get nasty. But one of the characteristics of this campaign is something more akin to reality television or maybe professional wrestling, in the sense that the spectacle element of this campaign has been so pronounced and so unusual. And I think that, plus the stakes riding on the outcome, have generated a couple of fairly prominent reactions among the mass public. One of those reactions is abject fear, and the other one is disgust. Now, I know that maybe those aren't the two things that ideally we would hope to associate with an election campaign, but we have a situation now where each major candidate, has a set of core supporters. And among those supporters, there is a tremendous fear of where this country is heading if their candidate loses. And then we have the fact that Hillary Clinton is the second least popular nominee of a major party since polling has been gathering this kind of sentiment. Donald Trump is the least popular nominee of a major party. So when you have a situation where both major candidates are so unpopular, you're left with a decision that a number of people wish they didn't have to make. As a consequence, there are a number of voters right now who still aren't sure what they're going to do, or who are resigned to casting a vote for someone they don't particularly like. That dynamic has contributed to what we've seen in the polling, where this race sometimes appears to be close, sometimes not quite as close. Right now, it doesn't appear to be as close as it was, say, 2 weeks ago. But one of the reasons for that variation is weak supporters, people who are at times willing to tell pollsters, yes, I'm going to vote for this candidate, who then sometimes move away, maybe as the news agenda points out things about their preferred candidate that they don't particularly like, reminding them of why they don't like that candidate. So they move away back into the undecided pool, or perhaps they say they're going to vote for Gary Johnson or Jill Stein, and perhaps some of them will. We'll know that in a few weeks. But because of that movement, really not between the two candidates, but between each candidate and undecided, we've seen the race fluctuate over the past months. So to talk about where we stand now and to talk about where we're going, I am going to turn things over to the panelists. We flipped a coin earlier. Jim won the toss, so he's going second. I'll turn things over to Charlie.
I'll defend the left.
Thank you very much, Professor Kerbel, and thank you, Chris, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be back. We had a lot of fun here back in the cold days of February. I noticed that bad weather brings bigger crowds, but I'm glad that all of you braved the beautiful day to come in and be with us. And I should say, as I did the last time we were here, it really is an honor, and I mean that sincerely, Jim, to share the podium with you. I have great admiration and true affection for Jim Brown. Through a lot of years, I have respected what he's done and who he has been in public life. And I share with him the bond of being a loyal son of Villanova, and I know he is about as loyal as they come. And I confessed, Father Peter wasn't here, so he didn't have any capacity to hear it officially, but I confessed that I might have transgressed one of the commandments with respect to Jim, because there are so many things in his life about which to be jealous, but there's only one of which I'm truly covetous, and that are his seats at the Villanova basketball game. So. We were here, I think, the day after or 2 days after the Iowa Caucuses most recently, and I boldly predicted, as Professor Kerbel suggested, that Donald Trump would not win the Republican nomination. That has been my fate throughout this presidential cycle because I think I've made probably 11 or 12 predictions and none of them have been right. So take what you hear tonight with a grain of salt, because this has been a cycle that has broken all of the rules in many respects. And I think we'll get a chance both during the Q&A and after our initial comments to reflect on some of those, and I'd like to. I want to give a 30,000-foot view right now. And let me give one disclaimer right up front. Although I am clearly the right-of-center participant here tonight and the Republican participant here tonight, I'm not here as an apologist for Donald Trump. I probably wouldn't do as good a job defending him as Mike Pence did last night. You're allowed to laugh at that. That's the best you're getting out of me today. So. But I've often reflected on this election cycle and realized that I'm encumbered by 40 years of experience in presidential politics, because the things that have been taught to me and inculcated in my little skull through the years have really all gone out the window in this cycle. It has been, as I suggested just a moment ago, a cycle in which all the traditional rules have gotten matched up pretty well. Whether or not any of those come home on November 8th is a real curiosity to me at this point. I'm going to be fascinated to see how many of the things that we have taken as the bromides of presidential campaigning, from the simple things like whether or not the blocking and tackling of politics, the grassroots organization, the field operations, the ground game, if you listen to the media, that's been so vital to campaigns that Jim and I have been involved in through the years, means that much anymore. In a world of tweets and Twitters, does the old-fashioned pulling people out and leading them to the polls on Election Day after having identified them as voters mean that much anymore? I think it's going to be fascinating to see. But clearly, we have seen already a variety of twists and turns in this cycle that nobody could have predicted. If we had been here a year ago and I had told you Donald Trump is going to be the nominee of the Republican Party, I would have gotten chuckles. If I had told you Bernie Sanders, a person that has never attended a Democratic convention, is going to chase Hillary Clinton around a tree until the very last gun is fired, you'd have said sure. And if I had suggested that we would be doing anything other than nominating Hillary Clinton for the nomination and having her lead dramatically in the polls the whole way through, you'd have said, you're probably not right. But here we are today, having witnessed what we've already seen, and knowing, as Professor Kerbel already suggested, we have the two most unpopular candidates since we began public opinion surveys. Let me suggest that they are the two most codependent candidates in the history of America. Think about that. If a regular Republican is running against Hillary Clinton today, let me suggest to you that this race is over. Conversely, if Hillary Clinton is running against anybody but Donald Trump, it all works out. I mean, they really are, in many respects, codependent. What we have seen in terms of the normality of this was the post-election bounces. As you know, the conventions were telescoped a little bit. They were right on the heels of each other without the normal spacing between them this time around. So there wasn't as big a bounce for Trump coming out of his campaign, perhaps by what happened at the convention, but more likely because of the time that elapsed between the Republicans leaving Cleveland and the Democrats arriving in Philadelphia. There was a pretty significant bounce for Hillary Clinton, not, let me suggest, simply because of what she was able to accomplish at the convention, but also because Donald Trump chose, instead of prosecuting a case for himself and Mike Pence, to take on Judge Curiel during that period with not such great effect. But after those bounces occurred and the normal leveling out transpired, we really returned to kind of a base election. And that has been, with a few bounces along the way, pretty much what we've seen up until the first debate. And all of you know what happened there, and all of you have seen the resulting shifts in the polls to where we are right now. We'll come back to that. I'd love to, when we get into the Q&A, kind of walk through in pretty precise fashion the various swing states and where we stand today, what's going on, where the numbers are, where they've been, where the likely scenarios are, and where the paths to victory are. Because I will suggest this to you, there is still a path for Donald Trump to win. I'll tell you why in a moment, but from a very broad view, there's a path. From a very narrow and specific view, there is still a path, but it's a much, much tighter road than it was even 3 weeks ago. It is a very tight road because of the swing states that are in play and the electoral math that gets you to 270. It's become more difficult for him. The reason I say there's still a path is, that although Hillary Clinton has a lot of advantages, numerical, monetary, organizational, and some would argue resume. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The one thing that she has going against her, in contrast to the demographic advantages that she has, is that she does not have the mood of the country. The mood of the country, frankly, Donald Trump is in sync with, and has been since the beginning. I think it's the reason he was able to prevail through the primary process with the Republicans. And it's the reason that he's been able, despite things that normally would have sunk any candidacy, to not only hang in, but to remain in the game. There is a significant cry for change in this country right now, and Hillary Clinton is largely viewed as the candidate of the status quo. Additionally, as Professor suggested, there is a tremendous distrust factor with Hillary Clinton, and when you have that lack of trust, it's very, very difficult to win it back. Jim Brown always had the advantage of working with the Casey family, who had exactly the opposite situation. They were highly trusted by the people of Pennsylvania. And so if you disagreed with them on policy, you had a difficult case to make because, A, people liked them, and more important, they trusted them. And I would suggest to you that that's a problem that Hillary Clinton has in reverse. And with 70% in many, many surveys of the people of this country saying that they think the country is on the wrong track, that it's headed in the wrong direction, being the candidate of the status quo is going to be very, very tough. Now, let's look just very, very quickly, and I know I've already shot my time, Jim, so bear with me. This is what you get when you don't choose to take the ball first. Let me just suggest what I think a couple of the strengths and weaknesses are of each of the candidates over the course of the next almost 5 weeks, because we're within that zone now. It's the red zone of the political season. Donald Trump is currently running about 76% among non-college educated white men. That's 12 points ahead of where Mitt Romney ran 4 years ago. Many of those people are registered Democrats, especially here in Pennsylvania. You go out through the Mon Valley, lots of places west of the Susquehanna. In John Wozniak's Senate district, I understand that the numbers there, Jim, are staggering for Donald Trump, a Democratic district, that it's close to 70% for Donald Trump through there. Again, non-college educated white men in droves to the Trump campaign. His base of support. Problem is, of course, there aren't enough folks that fall into that demographic category to win. The Republican Party 4 years ago, after the Romney loss, did a survey, a postmortem, and one of the things they said to us, there had to be tremendous outreach to the minority community, especially African Americans, especially Hispanics, and especially Asians, and to women, 4 groups among which Donald Trump ain't doing so well. But the one where he's really got trouble, in my judgment, is the demographic that is represented by where this campus sits, and that is among college-educated whites, a group that no Republican candidate for president has ever lost. And right now, Donald Trump is not only upside down with that group, especially among college-educated women, he's upside down by numbers that look almost impossible to reverse. It's better than 20 points right now in the most recent survey I saw. That's awfully difficult to close in the course of 4.5 or 5 weeks. The clock is working against Donald Trump, and that's one of the reasons why I suggest that his path narrows each day, because there simply isn't enough time to do the things necessary to change those basic opinions. So losing among, the suburban, more sophisticated women there, he's having a tough time with, and which bluntly his own comments haven't done a whole lot to repair, is one of the great challenges for him. Hillary Clinton, on the other hand, has, as I suggested, a lot of advantages. Organizationally, we'll come back to that when we get into the Q&A. Monetarily, she's currently outspent Donald Trump in Pennsylvania $16.5 million to roughly $6 million, just in Pennsylvania, one of the key swing states. And you think about that across the field of the 7 or 8 or 9 swing states, and you realize the impact of that. Again, whether or not that has any real impact remains to be seen, but she certainly has that advantage. She has a numerical advantage. Here in Pennsylvania, Democrats outnumber Republicans by still nearly 1 million votes, and yet she hasn't closed the deal. Let me suggest that, her greatest strength, at least the one that her surrogates will tell you is her greatest strength, her experience, in my judgment, militates against her right now. Again, it's a change election. The country believes that we're on the wrong track in overwhelming numbers. And so to talk about the fact that I've been part of this system for 30 plus years, I've done this, I've done that, I've done the other thing, while it normally might have worked for you, in my view, doesn't work so well for her this time around. Secondly, her campaign has been largely an anti-Donald Trump message up until this point. You didn't need to do that. He helped her out well enough on his own, you know. She now, I think, has to make the shift to building the case for herself, her vision for the country, and her plans to accomplish that vision. And finally, I think the thing that we've all talked about is the basic unlikability and distrust that she has among the electorate, trumped only by Donald himself. Finally, she has a problem that I think she really needs to address, and I believe her folks are beginning to, with millennials. You saw it in the primary election with the rise of Bernie Sanders. You're seeing it now in the third-party bleed. I mean, there's a lot of indication, at least on the surface, that the third-party bleed ought to be Republicans dissatisfied and disaffected by Donald Trump. But it appears that both for Stein and for Johnson, that the bleed has come largely from Hillary supporters, because if you take them out of any polling equation, she bumps up rather than bumps down. So I think she's got to make a concerted effort to capture the millennials that she has not made contact with. I want to chat in a little bit about the swing states, get into that when Professor Brown has had his turn at bat. I think you'd also like to talk a little bit about the debate just passed. I wrote a piece for the commentary that I write each week last week, just basically synthesizing things this way. Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, was once asked the secret to his communication success. And he replied with two simple words. He said, I practice. You know, good enough for Ronald Reagan, probably good enough for the rest of us. So I don't think that that's a word to the wise, unfortunately. I think you're going to get the freewheeling Donald Trump again on Sunday night, and we'll see what happens. But campaigns ultimately run on momentum. The momentum was appreciably and empirically proven to be running with Donald Trump prior to that first debate. How hard it was, you know, we could stand here and argue it, but there was clearly evidence that momentum was going his way. He was on offense at the beginning of that debate, and frankly, for the first 10 or 15 minutes, he prosecuted his case pretty well. He said the country's in trouble, it's the fault of career politicians, Hillary Clinton is a career politician, I'm a candidate of change, I know how to fix things. And he did it without being terribly rude and offensive, but you know what happened the rest of the way. And with that, I don't know that he necessarily lost much of his base, because his base is pretty well locked in, but I think what it did do was it stemmed the tide of momentum. And he shifted in that debate from being on offense to being on defense, and although he and his folks don't want to admit it at this juncture, I think he's still on defense. He's got to figure out a way to move back the momentum and recapture it and sustain an offense that isn't offensive for the duration of the campaign, because it's ultimately all about position. And right now, I think that his position is not the one that anyone would want to be in. But having said that, this is still an election cycle in which there have been multitudinous surprises. I would expect a couple of more. Thank you. Jim?
Charlie, thanks for saying all those nice things about me. We'll see if he's still doing that at the end of this discussion.
Just tickets to one game.
I'd like to thank Chris Kowalski for inviting us, and Matt Kerbel, both of whom I've had long relationships with, and hope to continue with that. I'd like to recognize the poet laureate of Chester County, who's here, Senator Earl Baker. And then my wife, Lynn, who's here, and sitting with Dottie Malloy, and she went to BC, but her brother went to Villanova. And then also Charlie, you know, I was thinking, you know, if you Google Charlie Gerow, you get like page after page after page of comments and video clips and all this stuff. And if you Google James Brown, well, you don't really get me. Anyway, just it gives you, so the stakes for Charlie here are higher than they are for me, because no one can ever find me, and he's out there by himself. So, but no, we have a great time working together, and I'm sure we'll continue to do so. I just want to talk for a few minutes. There's so much noise going on in this campaign, just all this stuff, and the media just loves it. But you know, I just, over the last couple weeks, you know, you got Donald Trump in a Twitter war with Miss Universe from 10 years ago. You've got my favorite one is the Hillary Clinton GOTV Get Out the Vote program led by Katy Perry and Madonna, who are posing nude on the internet to get people to vote. I didn't make this up, really. You can Google that too, I guess. Not while we're talking. Bill Clinton criticizing Obamacare, Trump's bromance with Vladimir Putin, and then the whole thing about, you know, Donald Trump's taxes. I mean, all this stuff that's out there, and I'm sitting there, you know, we're watching the debates, and I'm like, I thought the campaign and the debates were about what are you going to do when you're the president, and a lot of this has kind of got lost. And the other thing that I think has gotten lost is there are basic things. So what I'd like to talk about for a few minutes is you know, how to try to watch the ball in this campaign. And so just a couple things that I think that I pay attention to when you're watching campaigns. And, you know, I could be wrong on this, because I think Donald Trump, for better or worse, has just kind of redefined the way candidates for president act and talk. You know, the rhetoric is different, the way he treats other candidates is different, the way he handles the media is different. It's just, it's different. And he may know, he proved in the primary that he knew more than all his primary opponents about just how to handle a campaign in our world in 2016. So, but here are a couple of things that I think we should watch if we want to follow, keep our eyes on the ball. One is that, and this was in the New York Times today, everybody's recognizing it, Pennsylvania is rapidly becoming the prom queen of the election. And it's prom queen not only in the presidential election, but also in the contest for control of the United States Senate. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. I'm sure we'll talk about a lot of that. You hear people talking about the blue wall and the red wall. And I think that's something to always keep in mind when you're thinking about presidential politics. You know, I see all these, you know, these polls, nationwide polls. Oh, Hillary is up by 3 points. Hillary's up by 4 points. You know, whatever. And as everybody in this room, I'm sure knows, you know, it's all about the Electoral College. So you step back and you look at the Electoral College. The so-called blue wall is there are 18 states plus the District of Columbia that have voted for the Democratic candidate for president 6 times in a row, every time since 1988. And the big ones are California, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Michigan, New Jersey, state of Washington, and it goes on, but those are the big, rich Electoral College states. The blue wall that I just described currently adds up to 242 electoral votes out of the 270 that a candidate needs to win the presidency. There's also a red wall. The red wall is basically the Confederacy plus the Plain States and a couple, throw in Alaska, a couple others. The big ones would be, there are 14 states that have voted for Republicans in the last 6 presidential elections, and another 5 states that have voted for Republican candidates in 5 out of the 6 elections. Texas, Alabama, South Carolina, Oklahoma, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, Indiana, and others. So what that means is that the swing states that are really in play and that you want to pay attention to are there's a fairly limited number of them. everybody recognizes Ohio, but although I think Ohio, Charlie, is becoming less and less of a swing state by the day. I saw Sherrod Brown's old chief of staff at something in D.C. this morning. He's a senator, Democratic senator from Ohio, and I said, "Is Ohio really gone?" And he was like, "Yeah." No, he said I shouldn't quote him here. He said Sherrod still thinks Hillary's going to win in Ohio, and then he goes, Sherrod thought McGovern was going to win. Anyway, you're talking about Ohio. I watch Ohio, Florida, Nevada, North Carolina, Virginia. So-called purple states, but most of them at least started in play and will continue to be so. And Charlie said he's going to talk about Donald Trump's path to victory. I think the path to victory usually, in most people's views, involves those states. But then even with that, it's hard to get where you are. And you start looking at places like Virginia, which may be out of reach for Donald Trump right now, and some of these others. Maybe Florida, I don't know. But all of a sudden, Pennsylvania, if Pennsylvania were to slide from the blue wall into the swing states, all of a sudden that creates a significantly better path to victory for Donald Trump. And there's so much focus on Pennsylvania right now, particularly from the Clinton campaign. There's also the equivalent, when you get into Pennsylvania, there's also the equivalent of a blue wall in Pennsylvania. And it really is, for Democrats, it's Philadelphia plus the suburban counties. And I went back and looked at 2012, where Barack Obama is running, not 2008, so there's a little bit of the bloom that's gone. But if you look at Barack Obama's numbers, he came out of the city of Philadelphia ahead by 485,000 votes. And if you add add really three suburban counties, Montgomery, Bucks, and Delaware County. Chester County was kind of a tie, almost literally a tie. But you add all of them up, and Barack Obama came out of the 5-county region ahead by around 609,000 votes. That's not a blue wall, that's a blue mountain to climb if you're the Republican candidate facing him in Pennsylvania. Bob Casey, interestingly, because we now have the Katie McGinty-Toomey race going on, Bob Casey came out of that same 5-county area ahead, not by 609,000, but by 638,000 votes. He actually ran ahead in the 5-county area of President Obama last time. And again, he ended up winning by about 9%. So the question, and a lot of the folks that Charlie alluded to, particularly college-educated suburban women and some of the other groups that he talked about as problems for Donald Trump, they play in this, it's kind of the Pennsylvania blue wall. And that becomes such a big issue here because of the fact that people keep looking at Pennsylvania as the possible swing state if you had a really close election. So I pay close attention to what's going on in the 5 counties. And you think about it, if you're a Democrat running in Pennsylvania, you need to win big in those 5 counties, and then you're probably going to win Center County, where Penn State is. You're going to win Allegheny County, which increasingly looks more like a suburb of Philadelphia in the way people act. You're probably going to still win Lackawanna County because, as we say in Scranton, everything happens 10 years later. And that's about it. They're little county, Erie County maybe, but it's tough to get much farther than that. But you build up that huge margin in Philadelphia and the Philadelphia media market, and then that often gets you home as a Democratic candidate. Just a couple other observations. Charlie mentioned this. Hillary has a millennial problem. I think Hillary has always had a millennial problem. I think that's why she lost the primary in 2008. A lot of reasons, but if if you look at what happened in 2008 versus Barack Obama, the millennials kind of got up and left one day, and they all were aggressively in favor of Barack Obama. I said, when I was working in D.C., I belonged to a lunch group of Democratic chiefs of staff, and I remember at the very beginning of the campaign, one of the people at our table was a former very senior staffer for Hillary Clinton when she was in the Senate. And we started talking about the race, and at that point Bernie Sanders was not considered to be for real, and we started talking about this, and I turned to the former Hillary staffer and I said, you know, what about the millennials? You know, you lost them very badly in 2008, and you're coming back now and Hillary's 8 years older. And she threw a sandwich at me. No, it was interesting. I was watching her, and she's like, you could tell that they had been talking internally about this issue. They knew way back that was something that was coming. The millennials are a problem, as Charlie said, leading out to third-party candidates, and there are turnout questions. You know, turnout among the millennials was 49% in 2008 and 41% in 2012, and everybody thinks it's going to decline further this year. And then their media consumption attitudes, and we can't give all of them trophies, so anyway, people in the back don't take it personally. Democrats generally, not just Hillary Clinton, Democrats generally have a senior citizen problem. Senior citizens used to be one of the real bulwarks of Democratic wins. And just statistic, in the presidential race in 1990, well, I'm sorry, just the way people identify themselves at polling. In 1992, 53% of senior citizens define themselves as Democrats, and 39% of them define themselves as Republicans. In 2013, the 53 had gone down to 45% D's and 48% R's. And these seniors, you think about who they are in America, they're mostly white, and as they get older, they become more and more Republican. And that's a general problem. That's a problem for Katie McGinty, it's a problem for Bob Casey, it's a problem for all sorts of Democrats. Charlie said various groups that Trump has a problem with. I think his problem with women is something that he didn't have to have. He's kind of dug himself into that hole himself. And I always felt that, particularly with women who were not of Hillary's generation, the younger they got, there was almost this post-feminist attitude. You know, you talk to kids who go to school here, they're like, you know, who's Gloria Steinem? What about that? And I think with his various comments and stuff he said, it's he's dug himself a huge women hole, and that could be, as Charlie said, a real major problem for him going forward. Something else I watch is in Philadelphia. Those of us who've been in Philadelphia, watching Philadelphia politics for a while, there was this thing that we used to call the Rizzo effect. More recently, I guess people will refer to it as the Brexit effect, and that is that there are certain candidates and certain issues that run behind, that always run ahead, and on election day they run ahead of where they were in the polls. They used to talk about Frank Rizzo, that when he was the mayor of Philadelphia, that he would run 4 or 5 points ahead of where he was in every poll, because there were people who wouldn't even admit to the pollster that they were going to vote for Rizzo, but when they closed the curtain, bang, there it went. And a lot of people speculate on whether Donald Trump would be the recipient of a Rizzo type phenomenon. I was talking to a guy who was at a Hillary fundraiser, high-end Hillary fundraiser in Pittsburgh about 2 weeks ago, and he said Bill Clinton was there as the speaker. It was a small group, so Clinton, I think, was a little more forthcoming. And he pointed his finger at Brexit, and he said, you know, this could happen here. You know, nobody thought that Brexit was going to win. None of the polls showed it or anything like that. And then people went in and closed the curtain, and boom. So that's something that's clearly on Bill Clinton's mind. So you know it's on the mind of everybody else. Two other things. TV spending. I saw a statistic the other day that their own campaign TV spending, Hillary spent about $145 million so far, and Donald Trump was like under 10? Is that possible? I guess that's right, like $5-6 million. The question is, can you win an election on free media? Was basically what he's been doing. And then he also has made the point, well, Donald Trump, I'm going to write a check one of these days and be competitive with Hillary on TV going in. Question A, whether he'll do it, and B, at this point, whether he can get the right, whether he can buy the right TV. Somebody was talking to me about watching 60 Minutes this past Sunday, and there were 12 political commercials in a row on 60 Minutes, because that's what everybody buys. Now, question the value of buying a TV spot that runs in the middle of 12. So, but the question is, you know, I will tell you, in Bob Casey's race in 2012, we were outspent by this fellow Tom Smith, who was kind of a Tea Party Republican self-funder. He wrote himself a check, his campaign a check for $17 million, and he was on TV about 3 weeks before before the Casey campaign was. And that 3 or 4 week period cost us about 8 or 9 points in the polls. When he was on TV, we weren't. As you know, you sort of, they say you buy back. You know, you can't go off TV once you go on. And so we knew that we had a 6-week TV budget, and he had a 10-week TV budget. And so we had this period where the polls were getting tighter, and it was, all of a sudden, it was a news story. And as soon as we went on TV with our significant buy, Tom Smith hit a wall, and he was at 9 or 10 points about 6 weeks out, and we won the election by 9.2%. So if you think TV doesn't work anymore, and you can do it all on the internet, I don't think that's true. But anyway, so Trump has this TV purchased media deficit right now. Final thing is, I just, you know, given the fact that I did work in the Senate, I sometimes worry about this issue of governing once the campaign is over. And just a couple observations. In Washington, the House is going to remain Republican. It just is. And it's a function of a lot of things. It's a function of, in my view, a lot of it is the gerrymandering that went on after the 2010 census. And shame on the Democrats for getting just wiped out in the 2010 election, and then in the state legislatures all over the country that set the congressional districts. So, and Pennsylvania is a pretty good example. Every year, more people vote for Democratic candidates for Congress as overall in Pennsylvania than vote for Republican candidates. But in Pennsylvania, there are 13 Republican congressmen and 5 Democratic congressmen, and that may not change. You know, the way the districts are now set up. So that's the House. The Senate is 46D, 54R right now. I think there's a good chance that it could end up 51 Democrats in the end, or even 50 Democrats plus Tim Kaine, maybe. However, when it comes to governing, as everybody's seen over the last few years, everything in the Senate now goes under the filibuster rules with a 60-vote threshold for everything. So there's no clear way to pushing a lot of things, the Democrats are not going to have the supermajority that they had the first 2 years of the Obama administration. And then finally, you so you think of President Trump, and you say to yourself, okay, let me see, he's going to call up Ted Cruz and seek his help on a legislative package. And Ted Cruz is going to be thinking, he said, my wife is ugly and my father was involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Tough place to start. Is he going to call up little Marco and say, you know, I mean, there are some wounds there, I think. Now, Hillary, you don't hear this, but internally within the Senate, she is highly respected by Republican senators. And I do believe that she would have a better chance of actually governing if she got there, simply because of the, you know, Charlie said the resumes, but also kind of the way she handled, particularly being a senator, but then also the relationships that she built on the other side of the aisle while she was the secretary of, while she was the Madam Secretary. So that's kind of my basic comments. I just wanted to add one thing about, I was talking about how Donald Trump has kind of changed a lot of the rules. And so I've been watching that, and I was thinking I went to Scranton Prep, and there was a guy who was a year ahead of me named Ray. And Ray was a little quirky, we all knew, but in 1968, Hubert Humphrey came to Scranton to campaign. And he landed at the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton airport, and they had the limo there to pick him up, and he was going to drive campaigning in Wilkes-Barre and Scranton. Security then wasn't what it is now, and Ray, he actually did this. He bolted past the security guards, such as they were, ran out on the tarmac, threw himself on the hood of Hubert Humphrey's limo, and started pounding on the windshield, screaming stuff about Vietnam, unclear which side he was on. And of course, the Secret Service all piled on him. They grabbed him. They took him to the Moosic, Pennsylvania police station and started questioning him, the FBI, the Secret Service, the state police, everybody. So they had him sitting in a chair, and they said, why did you run by security, throw yourself on the hood of the vice president's car, and start pounding your fists on his windshield? And Ray said, I didn't do that. I just been watching the presidential campaign, and just saying. So with that, we'll have questions, I guess.
So, yes, Dottie.
Just a quick comment, because it just struck me so strongly when you made that last remark. Woody Hayes did not punch that player from the University of Michigan who was running down the sideline. He didn't do that. You may remember he got fired for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
It was on television, and we all saw him do it. He ran, 3 yards into the field. Stop and touchdown. God love him at his age. But he didn't do it. He didn't do that.
Where did you go to college?
University of Michigan. But I think I said this as nicely as you can. And this is now daily. This used to be such an aberration that somebody would just say they do what thousands of people saw them do. Well, but now every 5 minutes.
I would ask both Charlie and Matt, does it matter?
That's what I wonder.
Sadly, I don't think it does. I think we've got a culture right now where there aren't many normatives, where the truth is what you perceive it to be, that what you say can be changed at a moment's notice, and that people just say what they're going to say. I mean, I hear that all the time. They all lie. And that's, I think, one of the pervasive attitudes. Unfortunately, it's something that we, as a society, really need to reflect on and change. That's my only editorial comment. I'll try to keep it more objective. And I'm dying to meet Jim's imaginary friend.
Well, if I could say one thing about that, they don't all lie. Some of them lie. some of them are my neighbors, and wherever you go, it doesn't matter. They are all liars is one of the biggest problems in this election.
I think it does matter. I mean, I think there's a cost in terms of how people regard institutions, how people regard individual politicians. And I think, to go back to the point about governing, at some point this election will be over and somebody is going to be charged with governing. And I think it makes it very difficult to govern when we don't have a fundamental agreement on the facts. It's very hard to do. So, does it matter in terms of the course of the campaign? It doesn't appear to matter to people who are strong followers of the candidates. But I think from an institutional perspective, there are problems. Anyway, let's do other questions.
On the truth, though, it seems that like Hillary Clinton and the actions that she's done, like Benghazi, like the emails, they've stuck so much. Like she hasn't been able to just say, I didn't do that. To the point where even at the last debate, she just owned up to it and said, I'm really sorry, it was a mistake. Yet
it was a mistake. See, I think that's part of the problem. That's the language that we use for fundamental breaking the law. That was a mistake, an error in judgment. They weren't errors in judgment. I mean, that's, I think, at the heart of where we are right now.
Right. I just was wondering, why do you think, though, the email scandal has stuck with her for so long when certain things that Trump has done, that I understand she was like the Secretary of State, like I understand that carries weight, but it just seems like Trump has been able to escape things that he's done more often and just more easily. Like people just really do say, oh yeah, he might not have said it, it didn't mean anything, where it just seems as the things that she's done that might, cause agreements with others, she can't get away from as easily.
I'll try to be quick without making a debater's case. I think that the reason that the email scandal has stuck with her for so long and so pervasively and so deeply, you read the polls, is because what she did either jeopardized or potentially seriously jeopardized the security of the United States of America and every one of its citizens.
I guess I have to respond here. I guess, well, a couple things. I was going to use the Bernie Sanders line, enough of the damn emails, but I will point out that everybody's looked into this. And I'll just go with the Republican director of the FBI. Went through the whole thing and said, no laws were violated.
He didn't say that. Jim, he did not say that. He said that they would not prosecute her. Big difference. And because you've been there, that there is not a prosecutor in the federal government that's going to take on a major party candidate for president. I just want to make clear on that. Again, I'm not here to debate on Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, because I'm not here as an apologist for Donald Trump. I think it's this whole scenario that's been set up around the email scandal has to be based upon the real facts, and that's not what Comey said. And that's not the case. They chose not to prosecute her.
Go ahead, Matt.
So, since you guys brought up Brexit, I figured I'd ask, since Donald Trump has been working closely with Nigel Farage recently, what are you guys' take on him trying to working with a foreign politician very closely? What do you guys think it's a good idea for his campaign? Do you think it's a mistake?
I don't think anybody's made a big issue about it. And actually, I think if you took a poll on campus and asked people who Nigel Farage was, not too many people know.
Anyone?
I'll just add this, and I parenthetically, I think it was a week before the Brexit vote, Donald Trump was asked about it on national television. He had no idea what Brexit was. It was really pretty comical. The day after, he took total credit for it happening. But the only sense in which I think it is significant, and I do think there's this much significance to it, is that Great Britain, for whatever reason, has always been kind of a precursor to what went on here. If you go back to the Margaret Thatcher election, for example, and some others. Tony Blair, on the other side, have presaged things that happened here in the States. And I think to me, that's the only real correlation.
I do think that since the beginning of the Republic, having someone from another country show up here and try to participate in our politics very dangerous ground. Not to get historical on you, but there's this Citizen Genet affair, if folks remember that. This was a French guy who was...
Jim was there, I only was there.
George Washington was the president. And, no, Citizen Genet was somebody representing the French Revolution, and he came over and tried to stir up the United States to be supportive of whatever faction in the French Revolution he was with. And he was going up and down the East Coast, you know, giving speeches, getting parades and all this, and was actually quite critical of Washington's hands-off attitude. And Washington kind of gave him enough rope to, I don't want to say hang himself, but he just let Genet do his thing, and then what happened, fortunately, was his faction in the French Revolution got out of power, and he realized that he couldn't go back, and then he asked for asylum. So that was the end. But it was interesting. I was working in the Senate when the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, got very involved. Over the objections of the Obama administration, came and addressed the joint session of Congress. And there was a lot of unhappiness about the stuff going on, but most of it was very much off the record, and you didn't really see much about it. And my point here is that being seen as playing ball with folks from other countries in the middle of an American election is really, it's a third rail in American politics. So if anybody ever figures out who Nigel is, it might be a problem.
Thank you.
Jack, you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask two questions. One, I'm kind of fascinated by the turnout issue this year. I mean, there's always a gap between people who vote for the presidential election at the presidential election and those who vote for the Senate and the House, 4 to 5% gap. With a low turnout election, in a sense, the congressional election might almost resemble an off-year election in terms of, it won't get down to that 40%. But it's a question of who's going to turn out for the Senate and House races and not vote for the Trump-Clinton race. So that's one question. The other question gets back to your governance, and it has to do with if the Democrats take the Senate and Clinton is president and she nominates candidate X for the Supreme Court, will Harry Reid, well, Harry Reid won't be there, but will
Chuck Schumer,
will he try a nuclear option on Supreme Court justices?
Well, I think Jim would be a lot better positioned to answer that than I. I would just say this. I think that the party that exercises the nuclear option does the Democrat because the world is round. Because the world is round, you know. And I think that there's a lot of prevalent thinking in that regard. Jim, you can tell me you're much more inside that. The enthusiasm gap to me is one of the reasons why Donald Trump still has a fighting chance in this thing. I take my own little neighborhood, my little piece of America. I live in a strictly middle income, some snobby folks would probably say a lower middle income neighborhood. And I've never noticed much political activity through the streets of my little subdevelopment. But there are shrines to Donald Trump. I mean, literally. I mean, these gigantic handmade signs. They've gotten every sign they could possibly get from the headquarters. They've tried to outdo their neighborhoods with the trappings of the Trump campaign. House after house after house. A lot of them registered Democrats. I live in a precinct that in a very Republican county is registered Democrat. And I just was out in western Pennsylvania, went down one of the side roads, and I saw these plywood things, spray painting on them, Trump. You don't see that kind of thing generally in presidential politics. I think that the enthusiasm on the part of the Trump loyalists is very, very high. I mean, they're marking their calendars to the day that they can get out and vote for him. I don't see that kind of enthusiasm on the other side right now. And I just would harken back to something Jim said, which I think is an accurate comment about, I think you call it the post-feminist attitude. I was curious about the lack of millennial support among young women for Hillary in the primary, and I'm still kind of amazed, looking back just 8 years, at how much fervor there was about the historic potential election of the first African-American president, and there just doesn't seem to be any of that I have perceived anyway, for the potential of the first woman president. And, you know, I know that there are some folks who are approaching my age, shall we say, among women, to whom that's a much bigger deal than younger voters. But I'm curious, and I'd love to hear Jim's thoughts about that part of the so-called enthusiasm.
Well, a couple of things. The first one about the fall off from those voting for president and both those who are voting down ballot. That's traditionally the case, and you would worry about it in this situation. Although I think I've read and heard that, you know, the counter to that is that our voting is becoming more and more polarized, and people, although they may register themselves as independents or whatever, we're actually spreading farther and farther apart in terms of you know, identification with one party or another. And so I think there are those who believe that the consequence of polarization is that people will go back to voting straight tickets more and more often.
Which they've been doing in the last 4 or 5 elections.
Yeah, so, you know, we always, in Lackawanna County in Scranton, they always used to say, just hit the big lever, you know, bang, and you're done, yeah. And so that's an issue. As to nuclear option, so I was working in the Senate. Nuclear option was to basically eliminate the possibility of a filibuster and say certain votes, and in the case of judges, it's district court judges and I believe circuit court judges, could be done with simple majorities. And the Senate, whoever's in charge of the Senate, can exercise the nuclear option pretty much whenever they want. And they don't, because as Charlie said, it's, you know, the world is round. But I think Harry Reid got to a point of frustration where he did with regard to some low-level appointees plus the 2 categories of judges, not Supreme Court justices. I would say that I worked on the appointment of federal judges. That was one of my jobs, and we did it together with Senator Toomey. We would, because of, you know, most of it was pre-nuclear option, and we just followed this idea that judges that were recommended to the White House from Pennsylvania had to have the approval of both senators. And as a practical matter, not to get into the details, but they have this blue slip process where if both senators don't approve, there's never a hearing scheduled in the Judiciary Committee. But a matter of great frustration to me was that Senators Casey and Toomey agreed on a package of 4 district court judges. And that package has been sitting in the Senate Judiciary Committee under Senator Grassley for more than a year and a half. And this is after Toomey publicly signed off and sent a letter to Grassley saying, please move these folks. And it's internal warfare within the Republican caucus that has prevented the federal court in Erie, one judge up there, they haven't had a federal judge up there in 2 years. And this is with both senators from the state of Pennsylvania saying, no, please go ahead and do it. And then, you know, the Merrick Garland thing, contrary to what some Democrats say, there is some precedent for, you know, not going into a new Supreme Court term with only 8 justices. It happened in 1864. But no, I think that at some point, if you have a Chuck Schumer with 51 votes, and for example, there's still a long-term effort to just conduct Supreme Court with 8 justices, you could see the return of more of a nuclear option. And yeah, I think one thing that's happened is that the Senate is a place of, has been a place of this elaborate courtesy, you know, calling each other my colleague, and everybody's touching each other's elbows. I thought it was weird when I first got into it. But the reason that I concluded that they do it is so they don't kill each other when the fighting starts, you know. And to the extent that that courtesy and comity, fatigue, goes out the window, it makes it more and more difficult to get anything done, you know, because people do remember, you know, a little markup or whatever.
Yeah. Okay.
How do you think that, especially Hillary Clinton, is preparing for the possibility of what WikiLeaks might be putting out? They're talking about putting stuff out on a weekly basis now until the election. How do you prepare for something that's largely unknown? And if I could have a second question, why is the New York Times daily poll such an outlier? I mean, they have Trump ahead by 5 points every day, and all the others have...
That's the LA Times poll.
LA Times, yes. Oh,
Yeah, that's a panel. That's not actually a poll. It's the same. It's a panel. It's the same people. So the methodology is different.
But I don't know, are they registered voters? I see it on Real Clear Politics every day. It's so different.
Are you familiar with it? Yeah.
I've seen it. I don't know.
Yeah, it's not a typical scientific survey of 900 voters on a running basis.
Got it. Okay. Right. And I guess the WikiLeaks thing, is there anything you can do, or you just wait and react?
Go ahead, Jim. I guess, in my judgment, the damage that has been done to Hillary Clinton, unless there is something that is totally explosive, and this thing has now been ramped up, you know, the expectation level is up here. It's probably going to come in somewhere around here, and so I think a lot of folks are saying, oh, I think the damage that has been done to Hillary Clinton on the email scandal has pretty much been done. I mean, unless there is something really, really spectacular, I don't know that it's going to have that much impact. And the young lady back there asked the question, you know, why has all this stuck? I think it has stuck. But the folks who don't consider that to be a major factor in their vote, they're not going to all of a sudden say, oh, gee, well, here's this one more piece, and that changes things. I just don't think it's going to have a dramatic impact unless it is truly over-the-top dramatic. And I'm not sure we'll be there, Jim.
I mean, people have been bird-dogging Hillary Clinton for 30 or 40 years. So, question what, I agree, what can they find there? I do think that, and you hear a little bit of it in D.C. and elsewhere right now, there's this kind of low-level hum about where Julian Assange gets his information. You know, who hacked Hillary Clinton to start with and all that. And that, I don't think you'll ever hear that defense come from anybody clearly associated with the Hillary campaign, but you know, you may hear some of that kind of low level. You know, what's the source of all this information?
At this point in the election, less than 5 weeks out, how many genuinely movable voters are there?
I think there are two categories of movable voters, and they're, in my judgment, a little bit bigger than people would think, because you've got such polarization among the electorate for the pro-Trump and pro-Hillary people, that they are both the genuine undecideds, and that's 6% maybe the electorate right now. I think around that is a core of folks who haven't yet fixed their position as strongly as they might have. And it's one of the reasons why you see these polls fluctuate a little bit as events turn. They are the genuinely persuadable. And I think that number is going to begin to shrink. As I said earlier, that's one of the reasons why Trump has a little bit of trouble. But, you know, one thing I will say about Donald Trump is, for whatever reason, when he has taken a significant drop in the national polls or the state-by-state, the swing state polls, he's bounced back. When you think about the things from which he's bounced back, the dust up with Judge Curiel, the taking on the Gold Star, the Kahn family, the Gold Star family after the Democratic Convention, the most recent debate, after all of those things that, as I say, would have sunk an ordinary candidate, he has, for some reason or another, bounced back. And I do agree with Professor Brown that there is the Bradley effect, the Rizzo effect, whatever you want to call it there, because Trump has always outperformed his polling data. Let me just make one quick comment, if I might, Jim. This is the problem when you give two frustrated professors microphones. You know, our 5-minute openings.
Nobody
just
told
a little
me.
bit past 5 minutes.
Nobody gave me a stopwatch. So I mean, I could. We do have though. I should say we do have about 10 minutes left.
Okay, let me say just one thing very quickly, and then I'll let Jim respond. 2 quick points. Just I wanted to amplify one and touch on another. He mentioned the Senate race here in Pennsylvania. Today, there were, within the last couple of days, today, the most recent spate of 3 polls, one of which showed it dead even. The Monmouth poll shows Toomey and McGinty dead even. There's another poll that shows Pat Toomey up by 8 points. There's another poll out exactly the same time that shows him down 6 points. Now, you that are in the professional political science business can explain that to me, because as an operative, I have a hard time. Nathan, you can maybe explain it, but it really is just passing the thing that you have, and the even poll would show Toomey +5 within the past month, and you have this tremendous disparity. The other thing I just wanted to touch on real quickly was Jim's point about the red line and the blue line, the red block and the blue block, in particular with respect to Pennsylvania. He was talking about the various states, you know, in the Northeast, and it just struck me that, as he was defining correctly, how blue they have become. In the years from 1972 to 1988, I'm hoping that I'm right about this, and any of you can challenge me, Connecticut and Maine voted consistently Republican in every single one of those elections. Pennsylvania voted Republican in 4 out of 5, hasn't voted Republican since. New Jersey held its own, it was an even split. I mean, that was what the Northeast was just 25 years ago. And you've seen this dramatic shift. Anybody here want to tell me who the last Republican to win statewide in Pennsylvania was? Nathan, welcome back. I was going to call him Senator Baker because he's the former Republican chairman of Pennsylvania. I'm betting that he might not be rich. No. It was Victor Stabile. That was 5 years ago. Republicans have not won a statewide race, including for the courts, you know, the off-year elections, et cetera, in Pennsylvania in 5 years, and have not won the presidential election here since 1988. And while there was a lot of talk that this was going to be, you know, the FOP, Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, it is increasingly looking like Ohio's going one direction, and Pennsylvania is going the other. The Monmouth poll that I just referred to a moment ago now shows Hillary Clinton +10. +10. And that's in the spectra or aura that Barack Obama defeated John McCain here in 2008. That was a +10. In 2012, that was basically cut in half. Obama won by only 5.5 points, roughly 300,000 votes here. He had won previous to that, just 4 years prior to that, by 600,000 votes. So if you're talking about +10, that's an awful lot of room to make up in the course of 5 weeks or less than 5 weeks. I just wanted to amplify what you said.
Just one thing about polling, and not to get into the weeds here, but as Charlie knows, there are 2 pieces to polling. You know, you go out and you find your sample and you ask them questions, and then you bring it back to the lab and you do weighting. You know, trying to match your sample to the demographics that you think are going to show up at the poll. And I remember in 2012, the Republicans in the Senate and nationwide, they thought they were going to win. I mean, they thought that Romney was going to win. I remember having beers with a couple of my Republican chief of staff counterparts afterwards, and after 3 or 4 beers, I said, "What happened?" And they said, "Our pollsters just got the weighting wrong. They just got it wrong. In Pennsylvania, they did not anticipate, for example, the level of turnout that was going to happen in Philadelphia and whatever." So I was just reading, somebody did a study where they gave 3 or 4 different polling organizations the same raw data and asked them, you know, all right, from that, what does the poll say? And they got significantly different answers on those things. So that's kind of in the weeds, but that kind of thing does happen.
It does. Also, just for a little bit of context, I think Charlie's point about Pennsylvania prior to 1988 being largely Republican is well taken. I just did want to add, for context, that in 1972, 1980, 84 and 88, just about everybody else also was Republican. So those were lopsided elections as well. But it's true that since 88, quite a lot has changed. Go ahead, Don.
One concern that you've been touching on is the judicial concern. And this is one thing that I find really deeply troubling about the millennial vote. And being a change candidate and everybody's tired of the same old, okay. But change from what to what? We have a 4-4 Supreme Court. We have had 5-4 decisions in the last 5 years on marriage equality. 5-4. These are Supreme Court decisions. On abortion, as everyone knows, we've had a deep split in the country and in court. But in the court, it favors choice and permits abortion as a constitutional right. That is a close decision. And right now, I mean, I haven't sat there with pictures of the Supreme Court, but maybe that's 4-4 now, or close to that. But whatever it is, all the justices are 97 years old. Somebody has to die, probably 2 or 3 during the next presidential 4 to 8 years, even 2 years. It is possible, and this is where, help me millennials, it is possible to lose the constitutional right to reproductive freedom at the Supreme Court. It used to be you could say whatever you wanted about abortion because the decision wasn't being made in your states. It was being made in the Supreme Court, so it didn't matter how, virulent you became. It had nothing to do with your job as a senator or fill in the blank. But now, at the Supreme Court, that can be changed. That is, reproductive rights can go away with a Supreme Court vote. Correct me, lawyers, if I'm wrong. I haven't lawyered in a couple of years.
So
also, marriage equality can go away. That's a 5-4.
So
and that was 3 years ago.
Not debating the issue, and I will confess that I followed the tenets of my
What's upsetting to me, and see how upsetting I am?
With that,
Don't millennials want reproductive rights and marriage equality?
not in the sense that you're phrasing the question. And as I say, I don't want to debate the issue.
No, on the
Can I answer the
merits.
question, please? I don't want to debate
No,
the
I'm
issue.
going to interrupt you.
we're actually starting to run out of time. So if it would be possible, just to keep this comment brief.
I'll try to give the answer in the context of the campaign rather than debate the issue of abortion. I think one of the places where Donald Trump really missed an opportunity in the first debate was by not raising the issue of the Supreme Court. If there is one issue that unites his base in ways like no other, is to suggest to Republican voters the prospect of a court dominated by Hillary Clinton appointees for a generation. It scares the living bejeebies out of the Republican base, and I would suggest to you respectfully that it does for a lot of the swing voters. Because while you may talk about quote-unquote reproductive rights, the one thing that every piece of data that I've seen suggests is that there is a very, very thin slice of the American electorate that agrees with Hillary Clinton that essentially there ought to be abortion on demand for any reason with relatively few, if any, constraints or restraints. And that's a winning issue for the other team at this point, not a losing issue.
May I interrupt?
Yeah.
That is not her position.
Yeah. Let me comment.
Yeah, I was going to say, Jim, would you like to?
Well, just this. As we look at the Supreme Court, when I was in law school, there was we had a final exam in con law. One segment of it was true-false, and I just remember one of the true-false questions. It was this: stare decisis is a millstone around the neck of the judicial conservative. For the lawyers in here, stare decisis means that you don't depart easily from decisions that have been made by prior courts. It's a Supreme Court policy. I can't call it policy. At any rate, the answer when I was in law school was true. And I don't know that that's the case. That's one thing I have seen about the Roberts Court, particularly when Scalia was still there, that, you know, they reversed a lot of decisions that had been there for a long time. And that's the point. You know, stare decisis, I think, was a principle of conservative justices until recently. So in that sense, I think that what happens in the election is going to have a significant effect on the Supreme Court. But again, back to our question about would somebody on either side of the aisle, when joined with a president from the same party, be willing to pull the trigger on the nuclear option for the Supreme Court? And that may.
Just for a second, did you want to speak to Hillary's position on abortion?
No.
Okay. In that case, I will. No, I just wanted to give you a chance to do that in case you wanted to.